We had already prepared a short video talking you through the guidance, and the point of today was to allow you to come and ask us questions. So we're not planning on going through an intense presentation. Instead, we hope this to be an interactive session, albeit a webinar where we can't actually see and hear you. But to make it interactive, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to ask your questions, and we will go through those questions and answer as best we can. If you are having any technical difficulties, please use the chat function rather than the Q&A function, because the Q&A function will not be visible to all. So if you put a question in there that's for us on the guidance, we won't answer it. The chat function will just be for if you're having any problems. I think that's it by way of an introduction. Sophie, shall I hand over to you?
Yeah, so we've just, while we're waiting to see if anyone else will join, we'll just do a quick poll to see whether it's helpful for us to play the video, which is a possibility, although we did ask that people watched it beforehand, but if you want to see it again as an opening gambit, we can do. So I'll launch that poll now.
Looks like a resounding yes.
Okay. Yes, Jill could, so we'll hand over to Jill to play that video then, which is linked through our website.
Okay.
The Student Housing LPG is concerned with purpose-built student accommodation, in shorthand PBSA, housing designed and managed for students, increasingly not by universities but by specialist providers. The guidance is aimed to help with the practicalities of Policy H15 of the London Plan, specifically the requirements for PBSA to contribute to mixed and inclusive neighbourhoods, and for the majority of rooms to be secured through a nominations agreement by the point at which the building is ready to be occupied. To do that, we look firstly at how best to show a positive contribution and manage potential negative impacts on the mixed and inclusive nature of neighbourhoods sought by the London Plan. This needs to happen at a variety of scales, from strategic locational decisions through to building level housing mix that reflects diverse student needs and accommodation design. Much of this guidance is directed at those involved with planning applications, but there is also some more applicable to policy preparation, relating to, for instance, neighbourhood housing mix and the mix present in housing delivery activity. Secondly, we look at nominations agreements designed to help align demand and supply in a proportionate way. NOMS agreements, as they are known, secure the right of a higher education provider to place their students in particular rooms in a development, enabling them to meet accommodation guarantees. We set out what evidence should be provided when to give the planning decision maker comfort that the necessary contractual arrangement will be in place at some point beyond the decision on the planning application. We look at the wording that should be used in legal agreements, known as Section 106 agreements, and fallback direct let provisions, known as cascades. All this is ultimately about a balancing act for London, best providing for student housing needs, fostering a socially mixed student population, and in turn alleviating private rental pressures and supporting important economic sectors and a range of different academic institutions, and on the other hand, managing the propensity, particularly under certain market conditions, for development meeting other housing, community or economic needs to be crowded out by PBSA. We're keen to hear your views as to whether the guidance will be effective on those counts without unintended consequences, so do fill in our survey, or if you want to find out more first, join one of our online events. Thanks, Jill. So hopefully everybody heard that. So just to recap for those that have joined, this is a Q&A format, so we're not doing a detailed briefing. It's designed to be interactive. Please put any questions you have in the Q&A function through that, and Mikhailo will put them to me, or vice versa. If you're having any technical details, you can use difficulties. Sorry, you can use the chat function to contact Jill, who's our GLA tech support. So
far, no questions in the Q&A. what I will say is we will end this session early if we don't get any questions on the chat, but we'll take you through a couple of pre-prepared questions that we had, but we think that you might have had, and plenty of people have had. So I think the first thing to say, Sophie, is maybe to talk a little bit through how we scoped this guidance. You'll notice that it is quite a short guidance. It's not as detailed as some of the others that we've put out. And it's designed to kind of get to the point and get to the nub of some of the issues. So Sophie, if you could just take us through the scoping.
So we derived the scope from in conversations with the Mayor's Academic Forum, which is a sort of cross-sectoral body with representatives from universities, industry developers, and student bodies, as well as local planning authorities, who particularly flagged the issues that were in effect disrupting the free flow of planning applications towards planning consents, and causing lots of discussion and debate and disagreement. And those two issues were around sort of how different ways of interpreting mixed and inclusive neighbourhoods, and what that meant in different ways, and also particularly nominations agreements, and how different interests within that sort of legal and contractual process should be balanced, and still achieve the policy intent. So it was sort of dealing with some practical issues that were affecting the delivery of student accommodation since the adoption of the new London Plan in 2021.
I think that actually brings us on to a question that we do have in the chat, which is linked to design. So you'll notice that there isn't a design section in the LPG. And the question in the chat is there any guidance being prepared on recommended minimum bedroom sizes for student housing?
In general, we had quite a bit of discussion about whether it was helpful to provide benchmark room sizes. In general, I think the market is the outcome of the discussions was that the market has sort of driven up the quality to provide adequate room sizes of its own accord, but design of student accommodation is always evolving. It's quite a dynamic market, and I know providers are frequently reviewing with feedback from their existing student residents what works and what doesn't. So we're trying to enable that kind of innovation and flexibility to continue, whilst setting out that the core thing is that you should have functional layouts and provide a good amount of communal space and amenity space as well as bedroom space, and think about how all these contribute to an inclusive and positive student experience.
And I think it's fair to say from our perspective that over the past, say, decade, we've seen the quality in student accommodation driven up because of demand, effectively, and response to that demand. But of course, there may be people in the room that think we are wrong. And if you do, then please do respond to the consultation and provide us with evidence to the contrary. In regards to kind of general design matters, they are covered by other policies of the London Plan, and it wasn't felt that we needed to repeat those within this piece of guidance. But again, if there are things that you have to say about that, please do respond to the consultation and give us any more information. So we've got another question. How should boroughs deal with a significant increase in student housing development in their area? We have already exceeded the indicative target for the whole of London in terms of number of student rooms approved.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, we're conscious that whilst at the start of this process of developing the guidance, there was a real concern about lack of delivery. We're now perhaps beginning to swing towards the other way, particularly in some areas, and that may reflect current market conditions. And some boroughs are experiencing this sort of uptick more than others. And the guidance does recognise that, as I say, a lot of the guidance is concerned with navigating this balance between providing for student needs and in turn the impact the positive impact this may have on the broader private rental sector in alleviating pressures there, but also acknowledging that we need to continue providing conventional housing, and particularly affordable conventional housing, given that is also a need that's increasing. And there's only so much land and so many appropriate sites for housing, but ultimately conventional housing is more flexible than purpose-built student accommodation. So the background to the London Plan position with the numbers, the indicative target in it was about proportionate provision of student housing. It was never intended that we would provide a purpose-built bed space for every student living in London. So that's still there as a benchmark. It was particularly prioritising first years and international students in considering those to be most at need, who are perhaps less able to navigate the wider private rental market. So in terms of how boroughs should and other planning authorities should deal with that in their areas, it's important to look at the evidence in the round around what is the mix of housing in your neighbourhoods, what's the mix of coming through in delivery, and how that relates to your evidenced housing need, the positive role that student housing may bring in some cases in diversifying the market, to enable lots of housing delivery to happen all at once, but also recognising that in some cases it does get to the extreme and it has this crowding out effect, and we're encouraging boroughs to set out policies to this effect that acknowledge that it may be a spatial issue, so affecting particular areas and particular neighbourhoods more than others. So you might want to look at sort of numbers which are where you consider there to be too many in area, or spacing, or indeed to focus student housing, direct student housing to focus in particular areas and not elsewhere. But also, as well as spatially, to consider it as something that you're concerned with in the delivery pipeline. And obviously this is a lot about monitoring and keeping on top of that, but being clear that in your policies that this could be a material consideration as well when assessing applications.
Thanks, Sophie. I think the next question is actually linked to that, and I think it's worth us sort of talking a bit about what we're seeing from strategic need. But the question is, how should need for PBSA, both local and strategic, be assessed? You sort of spoke to the local issue through the answer to your last question, but maybe we could have a bit of a chat about the strategic level need and what we're seeing, and how that would then cascade down to the local, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so we're certainly aware that since we prepared the London Plan, there's been an increase in student numbers, a quite significant increase, both domestically relating to things like an increase in the number of 18-year-olds and a relaxation on sort of student number limits by the government in terms of how they regulate universities, but also internationally, and international recruitment has been important to offset sort of constraints in domestic fee income where that hasn't necessarily risen as fast as the costs of providing a university education by the university. So there's been a steep rise in the student population, and particularly the international student population in London. And so, but as I said before, there is a desire to recognise that we can only ever provide for a proportion of that need in purpose-built accommodation. It's only appropriate to do so when we're doing this balancing act with other needs for the limited sites in London. But so yes, there's been a steep rise, but it will be a proportion of that we're targeting. And the policy very much, and the evidence base very much takes that as read. We acknowledge there's a student need, a strategic need, so there's no need to go into to re-demonstrating a strategic need for housing, for purpose-built student accommodation. When the role of sort of more local needs consideration is where this sort of nominations agreement mechanism kicks in, because it's important to the appetite for entering into a nominations agreement by a higher education provider would be affected by whether the location meets their students' needs. So again, that's a kind of proxy. And when we, what we're seeking through the guidance is that, as well as sort of providing a letter of comfort that sets out a university's interest in a particular development, so we get linking with their sort of expected accommodation needs going forward, that they also provide a clear statement of how such development would fit with that and any other discussions that they're having with other providers, so that we have comfort that they're not pursuing schemes all over London and meet their housing needs, accommodation needs going forward multiple times.
Thanks, Sophie. The next question is, whilst there may not be specific minimum standards for bedroom sizes, would you consider including minimum requirements for communal facilities, particularly for cluster flats, which rely on shared kitchens?
Thanks. Yeah, so that's quite an interesting proposition, which and certainly we've investigated through looking at parallel guidance, which is currently in the final stages of preparation on large-scale purpose-built shared living accommodation, so co-living schemes, where there's an emphasis on, particularly on communal provision. So it may be something we do in terms of cross-reference to that, but again, it comes back to a general desire a general feeling that the market has driven up high levels of design quality, including space standards, and a lot of it may be down to individual scheme design and the balancing that occurs through that. I think we have got some general sort of pointers in the draft guidance around that, if you've got smaller bedroom sizes, you should be increasing communal space and that kind of thing. So as it's these kind of balancing considerations that are important. So looking at a scheme in the round, as well as sort of where there's wider access to, for example, university campus provision for social space, which, if you're building on the campus or very close to the campus, there may be access to that. So, but yeah, if there's a particular desire, and that's feedback we get through the survey, that it would be helpful to look at that, then that's certainly something we can consider.
It's worth saying we would consider absolutely anything, and in particular, if you think there is evidence to attest to why we need that, then please do submit it along with your response. So I'm going just in order of the questions to make things easier rather than jumping around. How detailed should student management plans be? For example, should it include a strategy for student move in, move out weeks, weekends, particularly in low PTAL areas? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, so again, unlike the policy on large-scale purpose-built living, there isn't a specification in the policy for management plans. So we've suggested it's a good idea to have one to help balance the amenity impacts on the wider area and concerns about things like comings and goings, deliveries, noise, and so on. So this could be something that's relevant to include within a management plan, certainly. And as you say, it's may be more relevant in some contexts than others where there's issues with access. But yes, so we're trying to sort of encourage management plans as a tool, and it's down to the discussions on individual schemes and contexts as to what goes in them. But again, if you think we need to be more explicit on things like that, then we can certainly consider that.
So the next question is also a good one around infrastructure, and it's about how local planning authorities should plan for infrastructure such as healthcare when dealing with a transient population like students.
Yeah, this is always a challenging one. Obviously, universities provide a certain amount within their own control, often including healthcare provision that's students specifically oriented at students. So sometimes that kind of thing is dealt with by that. But in considering the going back to the point about thinking about whether students are and provision of purpose-built student accommodation is sort of out of balance and affecting the mix and balanced nature of a neighbourhood, infrastructure impacts and evidence around that would certainly be one to consider. So yeah, I would expect that as part of infrastructure planning for a local plan that you'd be having those conversations with the local NHS and the universities that are from which the students are likely to be attending, in terms of what provision there is on campus or attached to that university, and what dependence there is on wider facilities used by the wider population.
Thank you. Now we have one about HMOs, or houses in multiple occupation. So the question is, should areas with large numbers of HMO student accommodation be targeted for purpose-built student accommodation? You've sort of answered this in a way already, in terms of potentially having your own policies in a local plan that allow you to target purpose-built student accommodation. What's also very interesting about this particular juncture in time is, of course, we've got high levels of demand and we've got a kind of shrinking landlord market. So even in areas that were incredibly healthy in terms of student accommodation, we're seeing, not purpose-built student accommodation, we're seeing a kind of shrinkage in the market that puts even more pressure on the need for PBSA in certain areas. But I don't know if you want to expand a bit more on that question, Sophie.
Yeah, so ideally, as Michaela said, and as we said earlier, there would be this process of filtration from whereby purpose-built student accommodation provides this alleviation role on the wider private rental sector, freeing up that for other occupants. But in having that kind of targeted approach, you really need to focus on things like the wider affordability of that purpose-built student accommodation. So if it's predominantly studio rooms, which are more expensive, you would perhaps be less likely to have that alleviation role. So hence, we do draw attention to that is a policy consideration. And whilst we're seeking a specific proportion of a product we've termed affordable student accommodation, that wider affordability piece is also important, and the proportion of cluster flat bedrooms relative to studio flats will be a consideration there. So, but I think you would need to really understand, who it's living in your HMOs, if they're students, which institutions they're linked with, and so on. So there's quite a lot of evidence-based work you could do before you could expect those sort of alleviation mechanisms to really work.
Thanks. This is the last question at the moment. So, oh no, there's another one popped up. But as I said already, in case anyone missed it at the beginning, please continue to put your questions in the Q&A function rather than the chat, and we will work through them. And if we don't have enough questions, we will end the webinar early. So the next question. This is actually one that I've been thinking about quite a bit lately. To what extent will student housing be flexible? Would there be the possibility of it being converted to residential flats, apartments, if demand changes? I think before we answer this question in relation to the LPG, we are in the process, I don't know if everyone on the webinar knows, but we're in the process of going through the Planning for London programme, which is our evidence-based building and stakeholder engagement for the next London plan. We're not committed yet to the next London plan, but of course we have to build our evidence beforehand, and we're already well into that kind of sphere. And I think this idea of flexibility and the need for the market to respond, or the need for planning to respond quickly to kind of market changes and also need, is at the moment more essential than ever. And it's a question perhaps I think that we should explore through that. So do get involved in our engagement through that. But in that ramble, Sophie, do you want me to repeat the question? So to what extent will student housing be flexible? Would there be the possibility of it being converted to residential flats, apartments, if demand changes?
So this all goes back partly to, is your site in principle acceptable for residential in the first place? And we know that some sites are perhaps targeted for student housing, which this would not be the case, and because it's generally, it has been thought that students will spend less time in their accommodation than other people would, and again, it should be a relatively short part of their life compared with how long someone else might live in a particular type of accommodation. I think COVID really highlighted that wasn't necessarily the case, and students could be stuck in a purpose-built student accommodation for a long time, and quality considerations have come to the fore as part of that. And so there's basic design principles and quality considerations that are applicable to conventional housing as well as student housing. We shouldn't be making those compromises. So basic things like daylight and sunlight and outlook, and provision of appropriate amounts of external and internal amenity space, as we were saying earlier. In terms of flexibility, I think there are obviously a lot will depend on the construction, and certain modern methods of construction do allow for greater flexibility and to move room and overall building configuration around more than others. Certainly providers have also indicated that they have quite a lot of flexibility to respond to things like the need to amend a particular room to make it more accessible to a particular student's disability-related needs. So there are sort of building technologies that are perhaps moving to a world where things are more flexible, but this needs to be thought about from first principles if this is something that we're pursuing, or a borough wishes to pursue. And certainly, as Michaela says, it's something we're considering more generally going forward in London plan terms.
Great. So the next one is about affordable student housing. Would it be useful for affordable student housing to specify a minimum lease number of weeks per year, i.e. 48 weeks in a Section 106 agreement? Otherwise, poorer students could be left without accommodation for a few weeks in an academic year. I also think that question kind of touches on whether or not something is a postgrad or an undergrad situation.
Yeah, so generally the details of the affordable student accommodation, other than the rental level at which it's provided at, which is defined in the policy, are a matter for discussion between the university, the higher education provider that enters into a nomination agreement to be able to place its students in that affordable student accommodation, and the provider. And different providers do have different models, but I would expect if universities are aware of a particular need amongst their population for a particular length of term, then rental term, then that would play into those more individual contractual discussions around the nominations agreement. It's something we can take away. I think it does vary between, as Michaela said, potentially between undergraduate and postgraduate students, and also universities have different arrangements for attendance, but we're also aware that increasingly, obviously, students are undertaking part-time work and may wish to continue that work during holiday periods rather than go back to their home elsewhere and get another job there. So there are considerations that are relevant to that, and so that's something we'll take away. Thank you.
So the next point is about a specific paragraph in the guidance. So in point 3.25, you mention charitable organisations and collectives that could act as proxies for a higher education provider. How will these organisations be verified as suitable proxies? I guess that would be, how would the local planning officer do so?
So this is something we've put in the guidance to acknowledge that not all providers are of equal size and have equal presence in the market, both higher education providers and sort of new providers of purpose-built student accommodation. So in some cases it may be appropriate for groups of universities to come together through either in themselves or appoint a third party to do that. I think we would expect those not to come out of the blue, to be introduced early on to discussions on a particular scheme, and for us to be for the parties involved, the local planning authority and the GLA planners, to be assured that there is the robustness of relationship that ultimately between that proxy provider or body and the institutions, so that we still have the policy intent being linked ultimately to that being a mechanism to demonstrate the need for that accommodation going forward. So it's I haven't thought about it in detail, but I would think it would be things like having appropriate formally adopted terms of references and things like that. I'd say that there is transparency and permanency intended by the arrangement.
I'm sure there would be multiple ways that you could demonstrate that arrangement exists in the long term. But again, if anyone thinks that there is a potential issue with that or something we haven't thought about, please do let us know through the consultation. The next question is, I think, speaks a lot to what's in the guidance in terms of the impacts at the neighbourhood scale. So the question is, what would be the best way to integrate dedicated student housing into an existing established community in order to avoid isolating them? Could these developments be required to include other uses, such as community uses, to make them more acceptable? The word required there, we wouldn't be able to do. That would be beyond the stretch of the policy as it exists at the moment. But there's certainly room for encouragement. And I think, Sophie, in answering this question, maybe we can talk about a particular scheme that we saw in Tower Hamlets that was housing a local charity at the same time as students. And, it really kind of demonstrated in this really valuable way how you can position yourselves within a community and actually genuinely give back something.
Yeah, thanks, Michaela. So the guidance sort of does encourage this as part of a way of achieving integration with the neighbourhoods. So mixed and inclusive, thinking about mixed and inclusive neighbourhoods in how you experience those neighbourhoods. And I would agree that it is about making the students not just a member of a university or a higher education institution, but also part of the local community. And so, yes, mixing of uses, including those that are publicly accessible in some way, whether that's to the general public or to a section of that because they're employment spaces, for example, is a good way of doing that, and is very much encouraged, as Michaela says. It's not so much the ability to require that at the moment, but I think it is definitely a relevant consideration in helping to demonstrate how you would be, through a development, contributing to mixed and inclusive neighbourhoods.
And as I mentioned, there are schemes out there that, in our view, are doing that really well. So we can always provide information about those, but just to harp on about the same one, the one I'm referring to was not only a charity moving in to a number of really well kitted out rooms within the kind of ground floor level of that student accommodation, but it was a local charity that previously had no home and hadn't had a home for many years, that was concerned with getting young people involved in gang crime off the streets. And within that, there was also other arms or potentially other charities that were also connected to young people and employment, young people designing their own clothes, being involved in media and production. And it was very impressive to see, I don't know, something quite genuine within the local community and you know, speaking to the local area. So yes, absolutely, we would encourage it. So the last question at the moment is, are university expansions geographically in addition to numerically, such as UCL East, having a discernible impact on PBSA demand, especially in the outer boroughs?
Yeah, I think that when a campus expands and that there's an increase in student populations and student housing need associated with that, it definitely there's a role in purpose-built student accommodation helping to meet that increased need. And you can see, yes, that UCL East has resulted in, for example, an upturn in appetite for student accommodation development in the sort of wider Stratford area, as well as on the campus itself. But that has been going on for quite a number of years, to be fair, given how accessible Stratford is anyway. But yeah, there is definitely a link with things moving east, and in a way that's kind of a spatial planning success, because this is alleviating the pressures on the more central boroughs that have traditionally been the focus of those university campuses, and as well as experiencing the pressures and difficulty in balancing the needs with their wider population, they have, of course, got the benefit of that university employment and related economic activity. So the fact that UCLA sees the actual campus moving east, not just the accommodation, is really positive for the wider sort of economic development and regeneration of that area.
Thanks, Sophie. The next question is a simpler one. Do you have further details, the name of the scheme in Tower Hamlets? Now, I don't remember the name specifically. It's a Unite scheme and it's at Aldgate. It was the one where they found the 16th century Shakespeare, or linked to Shakespeare around that time, theatre in the foundations. I don't have the name, but
it's Hayloft Point.
Oh, well done, Sophie. I definitely wouldn't have remembered that. Hayloft Point. If you want further details or you can't find it, by all means email us at the LPG email address and we can send something through. Can I just have a reminder of the email address, Sophie?
Yeah, student housing LPG, or one word, as it were, at london.gov.uk.
Again, last question, unless we get any more, is I like the text in the LPG about disabled provision. I think we might want to speak a little bit about that as well, about why we're seeking such high levels of wheelchair accessible provision. So this person likes that, but how likely is it that car parking for disabled users will be required on site at a one-to-one basis?
So yeah, so the wider context to the levels of wheelchair accessible provision we're seeking is that purpose-built accommodation by its very nature is purpose-built, so it's more able to provide for specially designed rooms as compared to potentially sort of HMOs that are converted from older housing stock in wider areas. And also because we think, given that historically there's been not much attention to this sector, to this specific need. There's probably quite a bit of latent demand. So people that haven't been able to go to a university, move away from home, and the benefits that brings, or to a university that perhaps better meets their needs and their course and career ambitions in other ways, because they haven't been able to find suitable accommodation that's appropriate for their disability related needs. So that's why there's a particular push for it in purpose-built student accommodation, and being able to be designed from the start. In terms of parking provision, obviously that's sort of related to wider parking policies elsewhere in the London plan, and those are well established and clearly set out. I think it very much depends on, well, it does very much depend on the location and the accessibility of that location. But certainly disabled parking provision there's generally an exception around that, as opposed to distinction made compared with other types of parking provision.
Thank you. I think it's quite difficult to answer the question of how likely, as you say, because it's so context specific. I'm not sure we would want to make a guess at that, but it's a well-established policy, as Sophie says. Next question, will the recording of this become available? Apologies if this was explained at the start. It wasn't explained at the start. I did a very quick intro, so you're more than welcome to ask. We can happily make the Q&A session available. Generally, anything with regards to each consultation goes onto the consultation page, including videos and frequently asked questions and things like that. So keep an eye on the page and things will get uploaded from there. Another question, what proportion of PBSA secured through a nominations agreement to the higher education institution would satisfy policy requirement as the majority of bedrooms?
Yes, so the majority of bedrooms is taken in a straightforward way. So more than 50%, that could be 51% in some cases, rounded up to the nearest bedroom. So and obviously the more affordable student accommodation within that's counted towards that 50%, 51%. So the more affordable student accommodation is provided, the less sort of market, if you like, provision needs to be covered by a nominations agreement. But we would always encourage more than 51% if there were an appetite for that to happen, because as we say, the basis for that part of the policy is establishing this really strong link between universities' accommodation plans, accommodation needs, and provision.
So I wonder if it's worth us talking here a little bit about, so firstly, just in case anyone on the call is not aware, the nomination agreement is the need to secure the majority of bed spaces for occupation by students of one or more higher education provider. And in the guidance, we talk about undertaking reasonable endeavours to secure this nominations agreement by the point of first occupation. And we've often had questions from boroughs about what, can be defined as reasonable endeavours. Should we touch on that, Sophie?
Yeah, so the guidance is the policy is complicated because you are only required to have that nominations agreement in place by the time the accommodation's ready for occupation, whereas obviously you're assessing compatibility with this policy at a point much before that, hopefully it's even started construction. So there's a whole, the guidance is written with this sort of balancing act in mind, desire to have sufficient information about the likelihood of that coming into place by the time, as I say, the building's ready to be occupied. So we're talking about a letter of comfort and a need statement at the application stage, and by the time that Section 106 is signed alongside the planning consent, then that Section 106 should set out the requirement for all reasonable endeavours to have been followed to get a nominations agreement in place. So all reasonable endeavours is a pretty high legal bar, and its interpretation should be advice on its interpretation should generally be from a legal representative, but it's going to require a lot of evidencing of engagement with different providers, higher education providers, persistent engagement with them, and not giving up at the first hurdle, and efforts on both sides to achieve something that meets different needs. So flexibility from the accommodation provider and from the institution concerned. That's probably as far as I can go without, I'm sure it will be different in all different cases, different providers' approaches, different universities' approaches, but that paper trail, audit trail of, as I say, and persistent, consistent pursuit of a nominations agreement is what will be important, I would think.
Thank you, Sophie. We've reached the end of our questions in the Q&A, and I think we've also covered all of the points that we wanted to get across. So thanks everyone for your questions. They were good questions and enabled us to run through a lot of things. So I think the only thing left probably is just to talk about next steps for this one, and to let you know what's going to happen.
So we have another of these sessions next Friday. Don't expect you all to attend again. It will be again recorded, and we will seek to make that recording available, but I would envisage that it covers similar ground. We've obviously got ongoing access to the video and the survey questions on the consultation portal, which is linked through from the London Plan webpage. If you search for London Plan Guidance Student, it will take you there. We've got a borough specific or local planning authority specific meeting on the 10th of November, and I will be reconvening the Mayor's Academic Forum during the consultation period as well. So that covers all our different target stakeholder groups. As in terms of actual events, we have also got a wider sort of Planning for London engagement exercise going on, which is looking ahead to a review of the London Plan. So there may be sessions within that in December that are relevant, so keep an eye out for notifications relating to that, to think more generally about revisiting parts of the policy if that's a concern. But this consultation, as I say, is very much focused on the guidance itself, which has to be within the bounds of the policy as it's set out in the London Plan 2021. So hopefully that's clear, and say the survey is electronic through the portal, but if you want a Word version of the questions to prepare those in advance before you start putting them into the survey, then that's provided within the document library on the portal as well.
And I think all being well, we'd be looking to publish this guidance sort of around the spring of next year. We're particularly keen to move this one forward because of the level of PBSA applications out there at the moment. So there's no more questions. That brings us in quite good time to the end of our session. I'd like to thank you again for joining us this afternoon and for asking insightful questions. And thanks very much for coming. That's the end of the session.